My message this morning is entitled Non-Passive Pacifism. So last week we talked about the spiritual importance of resistance in helping bend the moral arc of the universe towards justice. Today I'd like to move our conversation from the spiritual importance of resistance to the impact of active nonviolent resistance. After yesterday's shootings, mass shootings in El Paso, Texas, and in Dayton, Ohio this morning, as well as the mass shootings earlier this week in Gilroy, California, and in South Haven, Mississippi, it couldn't be more important to talk about this in terms of protesting for better gun control laws, as well as the importance of doing so through non-violent actions. It's far too easy to believe that impacting positive change, impacting a move towards true justice through active nonviolent resistance is just sort of a pipe dream. That is, it's a lovely concept, but it's mostly ineffective when placed within the context of modern realities and the modern realities of power and dominance. The reality is, though, that nothing could really be any further from the truth. The reality is that active, non-violent resistance doesn't capture the vast majority of the public's attention enough to sell ads and commercials, so the majority of big media groups simply, ignore it or underreport it. I mean, we can just look at the massively underreported Moral Mondays gatherings that started here in North Carolina to see the reality of that. And it may be that another reality that this kind of change, this kind of change making, this kind of peacemaking, this active nonviolent resistance is a threat, and such a threat to the industrial war machine. And those who leverage fear and violence and hate in order to continue to pursue and propagate their positions of power. It may be that this nonviolent bending of the moral arc of the universe is such a threat to them that they do everything within their power to prevent the mass distribution of reports that point to how effective nonviolent resistance truly is. As Mahatma Gandhi reminds us, nonviolence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It's mightier than the mightiest weapon of destruction devised by the ingenuity of men. To begin to understand why I, as a Christian minister, value active nonviolent resistance so much, I'd like to look at a teaching from Jesus that was the most quoted verse in the first 400 years of Christianity. And I'd like to introduce that quote that Bible verse with a quote from one of my personal heroes, Dr. Martin Luther King, who once gave this very simple core understanding of nonviolence. He said, "At the center of nonviolence stands the principle of love." Now, the most quoted verse in the early church was this, from today's scripture reading. "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who harass you, so that you will be acting as children of your Father who is in heaven. He makes the sun rise on both the evil and the good, and sends rain on both the righteous and the unrighteous." Let's just consider that for a moment. For the first 400 years of Christianity, the years most closely following the actual teachings of Jesus, the most important verses in Christianity were ones that said, love your enemies, pray for those who harass you, God treats us all equally, and we should do the same. Once again, from Dr. King, at the center of nonviolence stands the principle of love. For the first 350 to 400 years, Christianity stood firmly on the side of love, the side of nonviolence. For me, that begs the question, What changed? Our history since that point certainly includes many acts of violence, and frequently in the name of religion. Well, quite simply, the Roman government started giving Christianity preferential treatment. And quickly, Christianity went from being persecuted by the government to being protected by the government. On a side note, let me say right now, at any time a religion and a government get together, like we're seeing in the U.S., it's always a very dangerous thing. Now, getting back to early Christianity, theologian Walter Wink has this to say about Christianity's move from being persecuted by the powers that be to being protected by them. He says, once a religion attains sufficient power in a society that the state looks to it for support, that religion must also, of necessity, join in the repression of the state's enemies. And he goes on to say about early Christianity's relationship with the Roman government, for a faith that lived from its critique of domination and its vision of nonviolent social order, the shift was catastrophic, for it could only mean embracing and rationalizing oppression. The parallels with modern politics and Christianity in the U.S. should leave us all shaking in our boots. Politicians are co-opting Christianity and using it as a rallying point for selling their modern-day emotional equivalency of snake oil, trying to convince people that the fear and the hate and the violence is good for what else? And they claim to do it on the foundation of Christianity. Yet the teachings of Jesus tell us in the most quoted verse in the Christian's early history, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. I'm left with the feeling that over the last 1,500 years or so, we've drifted away from part of our identity that was once foundational to our understanding of who we are and who Jesus taught us to be. Of course, the sort of instinctive reaction and response is to say that it's really just the reality of modern world. The modern world, that nonviolent responses just don't work. But the actual reality is that the thought process that says fear and hate and violence bring about peace are the real myth. Or as Dr. King puts it, hate begets hate. Violence begets violence. Toughness begets greater toughness. We must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. Or as Gandhi put it, I object to violence because when it appears to do good, the good is only temporary. The evil it does is permanent. You see, it actually turns out that non-violent resistance changes things all the time. In his publication called Jesus' Third Way, Walter Wink reminds us, in 1989, there were 13 nations that all underwent nonviolent revolutions. And all of them were successful except for one, which was one in China. That year, 1.7 billion people were engaged in a national nonviolent revolution. And if you throw in all the other nonviolent revolutions in all the other nations in that 20th century, you'll get the astonishing figure that 3.34 billion people were involved in nonviolent revolutions. That's 2/3 of the human race at that point. No one can ever say that nonviolence doesn't work. It's been working like crazy. The reality is that nonviolent resistance is actually part of the founding of the U.S. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't horrific violence in our founding. It just means that part of the U.S. in its founding, it's actually built on the foundation of nonviolence. You see, American colonists reinitiated three major nonviolent resistance campaigns against the British. Stamps Act of 1765, the Townsend Act of 1767, the Coercive Acts of 1774. And collectively, those played a very large role in the independence of the 9 colonies by 1775. The reality is that there are example after example of this kind of resistance working. Nonviolent demonstrations led to the passing and ratification of the constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote, using a variety of nonviolent methods, including bus boycotts, economic boycotts, massive demonstrations, marches, sit-ins, and freedom rides. The U.S. Civil Rights Movement won passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Apartheid in South America was brought down in 1990 through nonviolent protest and mass resistance. And more recently, we've seen the rise of Arab Spring, the nonviolent movement in the Middle East. And most recently, we've seen leadership change in Puerto Rico as a direct result of nonviolent protests. For Jesus, for Gandhi, for Dr. King, for 3.4 billion people who participated in nonviolent resistance in the 20th century, pacifism isn't passive. It is active and creative, and frequently uses the system of domination against itself. And those of us who wish to follow the teachings of Jesus should look at the early church and their nonviolent practices and spend more time understanding how this works and then ultimately replicate it in our own lives. So, let us march on, bending the arc of the universe towards justice. And it will take the sweat of our brows, the creativity of our minds, the love of our souls if we hope to sort out a nonviolent way forward. But we must never lose sight of the reality that nonviolence is the only way forward.